Hearing will come to order, and the purpose of this hearing is to examine the current state of conflict in Sudan, including very pervasive reports of atrocities against civilians, and to evaluate U.S. policy options to bring the fighting to an end. And I would ask, before yielding myself time, and then my distinguished ranking member, unanimous consent that Congressman Green from Texas and Congressman Simon from California be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Good afternoon, and I do thank our distinguished witness from the State Department for his flexibility and my ranking member. We do have a series of votes coming up which will take up about an hour and a half or more, so thank you for the flexibility. Last week, I had the honor of attending President Trump's convening of two African leaders to bring an end to the decades of bloodshed and war in eastern Congo. It is through the President's leadership and his distinguished Secretary of State and the tireless efforts of other members of the staff that the leaders were able to sign an historic accord, the Washington Accords for Peace and Prosperity, the gravity of which we hope will result in a lasting and sustainable peace between Rwanda and the DRC. Yes, there already been some setbacks, but it is a well-meaning and I think a well-articulated effort. And again, being at that signing ceremony, I've worked on the DR Congo issue for 3 decades, and I almost couldn't believe that this was happening as it did last week. The President is a man of peace, peace through strength, and I am encouraged by his focus on engagement on Sudan. Sudan is under the darkest clouds, a catastrophe that has for far too long been met with paralysis by the international community. The people of Sudan have been subjected to unbearable pain, suffering, and loss of life, and even slavery for decades. 3 decades ago, in 1996, I chaired a hearing on the scourge of slavery in Sudan and in Mauritania, where we heard testimony that absolutely chilled our souls. I went to Khartoum in August of 2005 and met with President Omar al-Bashir and other government officials to press for an end to the genocide in Darfur. The meeting was necessarily contentious. Bashir denied any wrongdoing or complicity in the Darfur genocide. In 2009, however, Bashir was charged by the ICC with committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And in 2010, he was the first person ever charged for the crime of genocide. After meetings with Bashir and other government officials, my staff director, Greg Simpkins, and I visited 2 refugee camps in Darfur, Kama Camp, and stayed overnight in another, Mukjar, an experience that profoundly motivated me to do more, and others to do more, to end the mass violence. When our helicopter landed at the remote Mukjar camp, thousands of women and children danced and clapped and sang beautiful traditional African songs. The people of Darfur have a remarkable generosity and spirit, and it was awe-inspiring. Just about everyone we spoke with, however, especially the women, told us personal stories of rape, senseless beatings, and massacres by the Janjaweed and the Sudanese militias. Former Trump administration Africa director in the National Security Council, Nicole Witterstein, who will testify today from Human Rights Watch, lived and worked in Sudan for 7 years, and she was on that trip, and she recounts it briefly in her testimony today to Mukjar. Ambassador Sam Brownback, when he was a senator, along with Congressman Frank Wolf, were the first members of Congress to visit Darfur in June of 2004. Their historic trip, followed by an aggressive advocacy for the vulnerable and the victims, helped galvanize efforts to try to end the violence. So I'm always appreciative, we all are, for what those 2 great leaders did. Former chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Tony Perkins, has also led a delegation to Sudan, and in 2020 and today will testify that both the RSF and the SAF have a common enemy in Christians. Christians have been denied food aid and told, unless you leave your Christianity, you will not get any food. I mean, that is just, again, talk about coercion. Ken Isaacs of Samaritan's Purse, who testified at our subcommittee hearing this past May 22nd, will testify, and I quote in pertinent part, "Today, the humanitarian situation in Sudan has deteriorated further." That's just 6 months ago, half a year. It's gotten bad, worse. What's happening in Sudan is a man-made famine, with 21 million people facing acute food insecurity and 6.5 million in or near famine. History is not just repeating itself in Sudan, it is compounding. President Trump has called Sudan the most violent place on earth and the single biggest humanitarian crisis, and said tremendous atrocities are taking place. Today, Sudan is in a state of collapse. We're witnessing a genocide that indeed echoes the horrors of the 2000s, perpetrated by the very same actors who soaked the soil of Darfur with blood for 2 decades. The Catholic bishops, and again, when the faith community speaks out, they do it at great risk. They have been very, very strong in saying we find ourselves deeply disturbed by the ongoing devastating conflicts and the dishonored peace agreements in both nations. They're talking about South Sudan as well, especially with the worsening situation in 2025. It is alarming that dialogue is no longer seen as a vehicle for harmony, healing, reconciliation, and unity, the prelates write. The bishops called out politicians in Sudan and South Sudan for astonishing lack of respect for human dignity. There will never be peace in Sudan unless there's accountability for the atrocities committed by General al-Burhan and the Sudanese armed forces, and Mohammed Dagalo, known more commonly as Hemedti, of the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. These two have, sadly, savaged Sudan with impunity. Just last week, over 100 civilians, including at least 63 children, were killed in South Kordofan state when the RSF attached a kindergarten. To compound the horror, the RSF then reportedly attacked the first responders and the ambulances as they rushed wounded children to local hospitals. Since this conflict erupted in April of 2023, estimates suggest as many as 150,000 people have been slaughtered and more than 10 million people have been displaced. These aren't just numbers. Every murdered civilian, each child starved to death, each woman violated is a person whose life has been taken and shattered. I'm deeply disappointed by the previous administration's delays in imposing robust sanctions, which many of us called for, and allowing the fight to spin out of control from its beginning. For too long, we have dithered with Burhan and Hemedti as they cemented their power. It is unconscionable that Burhan was allowed to travel to New York to be received by the UN Secretary General, granting legitimacy to a man with massive amounts of blood on his hands. We must also be clear-eyed about the external factors fueling this fire. On Tuesday, the Department of the Treasury announced sanctions on a Colombian-led transnational network of hundreds of former Colombian military personnel who have traveled to Sudan to fight alongside the RSF since 2024. It is the illicit flow of Sudanese gold smuggled by the RSF through the UAE that is directly funding Hemedti's war machine. We cannot turn a blind eye to the UAE's role in supplying weapons that kill innocent Sudanese civilians. Simultaneously, we see the malign influence of Russia seeking a naval base at Port Sudan, and reports of Iranian drones bolstering the SAF. Sudan has become a playground for foreign powers, while the people serve as collateral damage. Today's hearing is again, like it was 6 months ago, a call for more action and a cessation to these hostilities. External financing and arms flows must stop. The UAE must cease all of its support for the RSF, and Turkey and Iran must halt military assistance to the SAF. Crimes against humanity, particularly by the RSF, including mass rape, ethnic targeting, and systematic looting, must be investigated and the perpetrators held accountable. And the RSF, I would point out, I believe, should be designated as a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO. I'd like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Jacobs, for her opening comments.